Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Home Secretary Amber Rudd says she bitterly regrets only realising the extent of the Windrush scandal in recent months. The BBC has learned that the government was warned by Commonwealth countries about the impact of the immigration policy 2 years ago. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has called on the Home Secretary to quit. He said Amber Rudd had inherited a failing policy and made it worse. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, has more.
Home Secretary, will you resign over Windrush?
Who knew and when? The Home Secretary, number 10. Everyone round here says they're sorry now.
Foreign Secretary, is the Cabinet united on immigration?
But how did the Windrush scandal slip the government's notice? Her department is taking most of the strain.
I bitterly, deeply regret that I didn't see it as more than individual cases that had gone wrong that needed addressing. I didn't see it as a systemic issue until very recently.
But does she think, as many in Westminster do, that the problems are a byproduct of the government's overall approach?
Home Secretary, do you agree that the net migration target has distorted the decision-making and led us to a lot of these problems?
No, I don't. I don't think that's got anything to do with it.
Have you asked the Prime Minister to get rid of the net migration target?
I have not discussed that with the Prime Minister.
You've not discussed the migration target?
I think I'm not going to be drawn any further than private conversations I might have with the Prime Minister.
You said when you were initially asked by the Chair that you had not discussed the net migration target with the Prime Minister, and then you said you're not going to be drawn on private conversations. Which answer?
In the context of what we're here to discuss, which is the whole Windrush saga, the whole Windrush sadness, really. I have not discussed the net migration target with the Prime Minister. What the Chair was asking me about.
The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans.
Those who made Britain their home were failed by the government. The government itself has admitted, treated as if they'd had no right to live here because they didn't always have the paperwork to prove it. Ministers are trying to make amends now, but there's no escaping from the mess round here.
The Windrush generation are not illegal. They are not illegal. They are here legally. That is why we are providing the support to enable them to get the documents for their status.
Jeremy Corbyn!
The current Home Secretary inherited a failing policy and made it worse. Isn't it time she took responsibility and resigned?
And just as Commonwealth tradition was celebrated on Whitehall today, some of the government's top brass are arguing for bigger changes to the British welcome for people from other countries. The Foreign Secretary suggesting in Cabinet yesterday there should be an amnesty for those who have come here illegally but have lived in Britain for more than 10 years.
Are you at odds with the Prime Minister on immigration policy?
That idea was about as welcome in number 10 as the hailstorm later. But the Windrush scandal has not just embarrassed the government, but has underscored the differences within.
And ministers have appeared to be very slow to react to what's been an emerging scandal over a period of some months now. And whenever, Fiona, something goes wrong like this in Westminster at a big government department, the question is often who knew what and when. But although the Home Secretary herself says she's only just really recently realised what's gone on, we can report tonight that the Foreign Office was warned about this in 2016 and they passed that warning on to number 10, I'm told, and also to the Home Office itself, who of course was the person in charge at the Home Office then, none other than the Prime Minister Theresa May. And another reminder of why this isn't just a hugely painful episode for people who've been caught up in this through no fault of their own, but a reminder again at just how acutely political sensitive this whole mess has been.
Laura, thank you.
The immigration row, triggered by the treatment of the Windrush families, spilled over into angry scenes in the House of Commons today. During fiery exchanges, Jeremy Corbyn called for the resignation of the Home Secretary Amber Rudd. The Labour leader said she had not only inherited a cruel and misdirected policy from Theresa May, but she had made it worse. Later, the Home Secretary faced a grilling on the issue from a committee of MPs. Here's the latest from our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks.
Theresa May was the great survivor in the Home Office, but the treatment of the Windrush generation is rocking not only her prime ministership, it's also put the current Home Secretary on the ropes. And in the Commons today, Amber Rudd faced calls to resign.
Her intent was to harden this cruel and misdirected policy, pledging to do so ruthlessly. Isn't it time she took responsibility and resigned?
Is he talking about me, the Home Secretary appeared to be saying, as the Prime Minister tried to defend the government's approach to immigration.
He talks about action that the government has taken in relation to those who are here illegally. The Windrush generation are here legally. Action against those who are here illegally has been taken by successive governments.
Many of those coming ashore were wives and children of men already working here.
The Windrush generation came here as children from former British colonies in the Caribbean, but many have been caught in a trap of trying to prove their Britishness to a Home Office seemingly intent on trying to catch them out.
Home Secretary, will you resign over Windrush?
There was no let-up for the Home Secretary as she admitted to a committee of MPs she only recently realised the extent of the problem, despite MPs raising the issue as far back as 2011.
Can I ask you, when did you become aware of the problem?
I became aware over the past few months, I would say, that there was a problem of individuals that I was seeing. I deeply regret that I didn't see it as more than individual cases that had gone wrong that needed addressing. I didn't see it as a systemic issue until very recently. We've got through 7,000.
We asked some Windrush citizens affected by the scandal for their verdict.
The anger's just rising in me as I'm watching and listening to it. Avoiding answers, telling us that they simply don't have that information.
Is the Cabinet at loggerheads over immigration, Home Secretary?
Amber Rudd chose not to answer, but the Windrush scandal has exposed not only a shocking disregard within the Home Office of the effect of these policies, but also deep divisions within the government on their overall approach to immigration.
The Home Secretary denied that the government, particularly Theresa May's drive to get immigration down into the tens of thousands, had fueled the saga. But she did admit that she'd had private conversations with the Prime Minister over immigration. Amber Rudd might have hoped that her promise to fast-track citizenship for the Windrush generation might have drawn a line under this saga, but today has shown she's by no means off the hook yet.
Romilly Weeks at Westminster, thank you.
Inevitably, the Windrush scandal dominated proceedings in Westminster today, with the Home Secretary Amber Rudd coming under more pressure to resign. Jeremy Corbyn demanding the government rethink what he called its cruel immigration policy and to get rid of bogus targets. Mrs Rudd told MPs she bitterly regretted her failure to grasp the scale of the scandal sooner. But she echoed the Prime Minister, saying there was nothing wrong with trying to remove people who were in the country unlawfully. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent, Simon Israel, has this report.
Within hours of calls for her to resign, the Home Secretary was in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee, facing hostile questions about her hostile immigration environment and the possible impact on the Windrush scandal. Amber Rudd explained she only became aware of the growing problem earlier this year.
I deeply regret that I didn't see it as more than individual cases that had gone wrong that needed addressing. I didn't see it as a systemic issue until very recently.
The committee's chair, Yvette Cooper, highlighted several cases featured on Channel 4 News, including that of Trevor Johnson.
Mr Johnson came here in 1971.
He'd been asked for year-on-year proof he'd been in the UK.
This is me.
Even though he was given settlement when he came as a boy.
And we've also heard that people are being asked for 4 different pieces of proof for each year. Do you have 4 different pieces of proof as to where you were living in 1989?
Well, this is the core of the problem, which is that people who arrived before January 1973 were entitled to residency and to apply for the legal status of being British, but they were never sufficiently encouraged to do so, to regularise their position. And the Home Office itself, over decades, wasn't aware that this particular cohort needed different treatment. And that's what I'm trying to change.
As MPs probed the causes of the fiasco, the Home Secretary denied it was anything to do with removal targets or hostile environment measures or a culture of disbelief. But she did admit her department was too slow and too late in responding.
Home Secretary, do you agree that the net migration target has distorted the decision making and led us to a lot of these problems?
No, I don't. I don't think that's got anything to do with it. What we've got is a situation where a group of people who should have been properly documented, who are entitled to be here legally, have not had the evidence that they should be. That's what I'm committed to putting right. I don't think that's got anything to do with it.
Have you asked the Prime Minister to get rid of the net migration target?
I have not discussed that with the Prime Minister.
But earlier the committee was told that immigration officers were constantly under pressure to meet certain targets.
We've seen more and more challenging targets, starting with the announcement of the net migration target. That is translated down through the operational arms of the Home Office to a certain number of decisions made within 180 days, unless they are exceptionally complicated. A net removals target that enforcement teams have to meet, so they are aiming to remove a certain number of individuals in any given month reported.
But that talk of targets appeared to catch the Home Secretary and her Director General unawares.
Well, I haven't had the benefit of seeing or listening to the evidence she's given, so I'll have to come back to you on it.
Mr. Williams?
I said
do net removal targets exist? Surely you should know.
I said earlier on, I don't think they do exist. We publish. There are no published removals targets, and there is nothing broken down by region, as far as I know.
So, in spite of Windrush, the government's immigration policy has not yet passed its sell-by date. But at Prime Minister's question time, Labour called for Amber Rudd to go.
The current Home Secretary inherited a failing policy and made it worse. Isn't it time she took responsibility and resigned?
We are acting to ensure that those people who are here legally are given the support that they need. We welcomed the Windrush generation those many years ago. They are British, they are part of us, and we are ensuring that they remain here and are able to continue to live their lives here.
More than 1,300 possible Windrush cases have so far been identified by the Home Office helpline, and that's only in its first week. Access to compensation for loss of work, legal fees, distress, divided families and more is still being worked on.
Simon Israel reporting. Well, joining us now from Westminster, Stephen Doughty MP, Labour member of the Home Affairs Committee, and with me here in the studio, Vince McBean, Chairman of the West Indian Association of Service Personnel, and Sally Daglian, the Chief Executive of Praxis, a charity that works with vulnerable migrants. Let me begin with you, Stephen Doughty. Last night on this programme, your colleague, your Labour MP colleague, David Lammy, said that fundamentally, when it comes to immigration, there has been a race to the bottom in which both Labour and the Conservatives have been involved. Do you accept that?
Well, I think there's been a series of errors made at the Home Office over a period of time, but let's be clear, the trail on this runs directly to the door of number 10 and the policies that the Prime Minister introduced when she was in the Home Office. And this is what happens when you have a policy like the hostile environment. You introduce cutbacks on staff at the Home Office, you reduce their options for a discretion, you reduce the rights to appeal, the rights to legal aid, you end up with terrible decisions that affect the lives of those that were seen on your programme last night.
Now, obviously, very clearly, the emphasis has been on the Windrush generation. But in truth, there are huge numbers of other ethnicities and country of origin people who have many of the same problems, but who are getting no attention.
Absolutely right, and that was what I and other members of the committee raised today with the Home Secretary and the civil servants. My own constituency in Cardiff Docks area has a huge history of immigration over hundreds of years from the Empire, the Commonwealth, many other countries, people who've made a huge contribution. And I have seen case after case after case, not just from those from Caribbean communities, but from Africa, from the Indian subcontinent, from elsewhere, people who've been affected in this way by the Home Office. And this is the result of a hostile environment policy that simply doesn't take people and their individual lives into account.
This is surely a moment when people hope that MPs will pull together and sort this out. This is a crisis, and it needs sorting out very quickly. At the moment, the emphasis is on attacking the government for having got us into this mess. But isn't it now up to all parties to pull together and quickly resolve this, and indeed even help the Home Secretary to do so?
Well, indeed, I mean, that was very much the tone of the questions that we were asking today. I mean, we wanted to know what compensation is going to be offered, who's available to be helped by the helpline, what are the options going to be available for those who've been caught up in these scandals, not just the Windrush generation, but those from those other countries that we've mentioned, including my own constituents. And I think it's very important that the government get a rapid hold on this, that we have the information as MPs and able to be able to get that out to our constituents to help those who've been affected. And that fundamentally we stop blurring this line between those who are here illegally and those who have a legal right to be here or who are indeed British citizens.
But very briefly, is that consistent with your leader demanding the resignation of the Home Secretary?
Well, look, I think all ministers who've been involved in this scandal, have to look at their situations. As I said, I think the trail runs very much to the door of number 10, to the Prime Minister and the decisions she took when she was at the Home Office. Right. But fundamentally, this also has to be about immediately supporting those who've been affected. I spoke to a number of the people afterwards who've been affected, and their stories are truly heartbreaking.
Stephen Doughty, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, let me turn to you, Vince McBean. You were born in Jamaica. Yes. You came here in 1968, well before the Immigration Act changes. Indeed, you had right to remain. Absolutely. And yet you served in the British Army, you had to be invalided out, and you then had to pay £90, which is a huge sum in those days, to get your...
nationalisation.
Exactly. So, I mean, what do you make of what's going on right now?
Well, it's scandalous what's happened. It's quite clear that when it comes to the politicians, they look at immigration as a way of getting votes. And that's what's happened. And you have many individuals such as myself, ex-soldiers, who have been in the forces and have no right to stay here. So that's another scandal on part of...
How big is your organisation?
Well, the organisation is here to represent soldiers from the Caribbean and Africa. And we have cases like this. We usually get about under 10 a year. And then we have the wider community who we also have to help and assist.
But there are surely many in that wider community who having got into this situation, are being regarded as illegal even though they are British citizens.
Absolutely.
Who daren't come forward.
That's what's happening. Everybody will go... What happens is that, for argument's sake, the soldiers. One of our members, 54 years in this country, served in the British Army. He then said he was going to get his passport. He applied for his passport. What happened? He got a letter for immigration, said he had no right to stay here. Immediately, no recourse to public funds, any support whatsoever. And if he leaves the country, he has no right to appeal. So we had to put money together with the fact of providing the legal services he needs to be able to stay in this country now. So that's what's really happening on the ground. And when these things happen, everybody goes underground.
Well, now that brings us to you, Sally Dagley, of Praxis, which works with immigrants. And I'm wondering what you make of this, given that you've been on the front line, for many years.
Well, I think it's shocking, and the stories that we've heard are appalling. People's lives have been devastated. It's not just the Windrush generation. The problems are much deeper. There are systemic failings in the Home Office. And frankly, it's incredible that the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary can pretend that they didn't know it was happening. And many of the changes that were brought in from 2014 onwards, in fact, there were civil society organisations, legal organisations, and many others actually warning that what was going to happen was that there were many people in the UK who are here lawfully resident, but wouldn't be able to meet the new requirements.
Vince, you hinted at it, and I'm thinking that we had a populist party in UKIP, quickly followed by the other parties trying to keep them at bay, who wanted to deport large numbers of immigrants, wanted to cut immigration. And this was the response.
I think if you deliberately create a hostile system, a hostile environment, then it has an impact on every migrant. And that's what we see. And we see it on a daily basis in our charity, people who've become homeless or people who've lost their jobs, people who've got no recourse to public funds.
But what do you say then, to people they're probably quite decent people, but they have these views that they believe that, immigration is the route to their misery?
Well, what we've actually seen since these stories have been coming to light is that the British public wants a fair system, and the support that has been shown to people like our client Albert Thompson, who was denied cancer care despite having lived in the UK quite lawfully for over 40 years. People actually think it's unjust. So I think when people understand the workings of the system and they can hear the individual stories, we now have an immigration system that has no humanity. It has no respect for the individuals. And I think ideology is taken over from actually respect for individuals and fair treatment.
Well, Vince, I want to end with your story. And I want to end with you getting shot as a British soldier. What happened to you?
Well, I got injured when I was on duty, and I got air-backed back to here. And I underwent 7 operations so far. And I went to Chessington. They have a rehabilitation centre there.
You said so far. You mean you're still having the operation?
I meant to have fusion to L2, 3, and 4 disc in my back. But I will lose 5% of my ability to move. So I don't want that. I'm meant to take 2 500 milligram of...
And this, as a British citizen, was in the service of Her Majesty's government.
Yep.
And you were demanded £90, which was a huge sum of money.
To pay for it.
To pay for it.
That privilege.
I mean, it beggars belief that this could be true. And it indicates that what we're looking at today has been going on for years and years and years.
My organisation has been for over a decade on Remembrance Sunday. We've been making clear issue about this matter. So many people are aware of it, that there's many soldiers and there's many people in our community who suffer. And indeed, there was, from what I can gather, there was an impact assessment done on this same topic. But it's quite also clear, if you want to get votes, you create this environment which we now have, and it's uncaring. And when you hear one of the ministers say they don't know what's happening in their own department, that was the shocking part. And I listened to the news or listened to the interview before, and I was saying, well, how come she doesn't know? And Glenn Williams next to her was no different than the same.
Well, Vince McBean, thank you very much indeed for coming in. And Sally Teglin, thank you very much indeed too.
And more political embarrassment for the Home Secretary today. She had to answer for herself at a Commons committee with difficult questions about whether she knew immigration enforcement was causing injustices, and if not, why not, when warnings were given as early as 2016. She also faces the challenge of sorting out the Home Office. She accepted a culture change needs to occur there. Now, if you're writing a memo to Amber Rudd on what to do now, you'd have a lot to discuss. Should concessions to the Windrush arrivals be extended to many more people? Should there be a full amnesty for anyone who was here, say, 10 years ago? That was reportedly an argument in Cabinet yesterday. Should the hostile environment policy be watered down, abandoned, or simply applied with more discretion? And then your memo would need to address the rawest issue of all. Should there be a new Home Secretary to implement it all? It is, after all, often better for there to be a fresh start. Well, our policy editor, Chris Cook, hasn't written a memo on it, but he has made this report for us.
The Windrush generation are Britons, who arrived in Britain from British colonies prior to 1973. So why have they suffered so much at the hands of the British government? That was the key question today for Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, when she was grilled by the Home Affairs Select Committee.
Can I ask you, when did you become aware of the problem?
I became aware over the past few months, I would say, that there was a problem of individuals that I was seeing. This was covered, as far as I could see, from newspapers and MPs bringing it forward anecdotally over the past 3 or 4 months. And I became aware that there was a potential issue. I deeply regret that I didn't see it as more than individual cases that had gone wrong that needed addressing. I didn't see it as a systemic issue until very recently.
One former immigration minister is puzzled at how long it took to notice.
I think the Home Office and government has handled the situation appallingly. They must have seen the media reports. They had letters coming in from members of Parliament. Ministers replied to those letters, the Immigration Minister and the Home Secretary. They could see a pattern of what was happening, that people who had spent virtually all their adult lives here, given so much to our economy, so much to our public services, were being treated in a really disgraceful way.
In any case, earlier today, the Foreign Office confirmed that in April 2016, as part of its regular ministerial dialogue with Caribbean partners, FCA ministers were made aware of concerns about some immigration deportation cases. And a core function of the FCO is relaying concerns raised by partners with us to the relevant parts of government. In April 2016, of course, the Home Secretary was Theresa May. We also learned that some huge questions remain unanswered, like how many people have been wrongly imprisoned?
We need to know if the state has wrongfully incarcerated people.
I agree with that, but I mean, how far back would you suggest, for instance, that we should go?
No, we certainly need to know about the last few years, and I think, to go back as far as is reasonably possible.
We don't know how many people have lost health care.
It's difficult for us to work out whether anybody individually has been affected by applying for support in a hospital and has or hasn't had the service that they need given to them.
There is a lot that we still don't know about. We don't know how many Britons have been locked up or are stuck, exiled far from home as a result of this scandal. We don't know who knew what when in the Home Office. We also don't know what it will take to fix this. That is to say, we don't know whether it's possible for the Home Office to be as aggressive as it has historically been while making a few administrative tweaks to make things work, or whether our immigration department needs a fundamental change to the way that it looks at the world. Just consider the demands being made of people to prove they've lived in Britain since 1973.
And we've also heard that people are being asked for 4 different pieces of proof for each year. Do you have 4 different pieces of proof as to where you were living in 1989?
Millions of people are affected by this guilty until proven innocent attitude, including now EU migrants. So the Home Secretary has called for a culture change in her department. But she wouldn't say today who is to blame for the current Home Office culture. Her or her long-serving predecessor?
Chris Cook there. We will discuss that in a moment. But meanwhile, decisions do have to be taken about individual cases. Home Office officials have been told to think about the individual, not the policy. Well, interesting cases that are distinct from Windrush are emerging, and here's one now. We've taken a tough line on immigrants as a nation, but what about asylum seekers? We have spoken to one today. She's 19, she lives in Bristol. Her application for asylum was refused, but is being appealed. Now, she came here as a child, age 14, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and a new rule which took effect only this year, prompted the Home Office to tell her that she was not allowed to sit her A-levels this summer. Under the rule, new conditions were imposed on some young asylum seekers on their right to study, even if they'd already been in school for years here. Well, these cases are often twisty, and on Monday, the woman you're about to see was granted a temporary reprieve to continue her studies, thanks to the High Court, no less. being an asylum seeker. She fears persecution if she returns home, and because of that, we're not showing her face or naming her. She's been speaking to Phil Kemp.
I remember my head teacher used to call me a superstar, because on that time my English was very, very bad. The only thing I can say was okay and no. But now, you know, I can speak, and yeah. I have won a reward in my college for being, for having a good conduct and good behaving in the school.
So when did you first hear that there might be a problem with you going to college and sitting your exams?
I was just preparing my exam, my first exam for health and social care. Then reading that letter was like, why? What is this? But my college was like, no, why? They ask you to stop just on the way like this. You have like 3 more maths to finish. My teachers was really upset, especially my health and social care teacher, because she's the one who was like helping me for my exam. I started health and social care with a grade C, and now I'm aiming a B or A. So she was like, why now, why? But we didn't have a choice, really. I'm not a student who's like making trouble or being in the police or those kind of things. But I'm really polite. If you tell me stop, I will stop. If you tell me carry on, I will carry on. And telling me to stop studies for me was a bad decision ever in my life. I've been waiting for 4 years already, which is long. And to tell someone like to hold on with her studies after 4 years, for me, is a wrong decision. Because of this situation, I think my grade will will drop down, which is a bad thing for me. So, yeah.
Well, that's one case from Bristol. We did ask the Home Office to comment, and they told us that the case is ongoing, and if someone disputes the study restriction on their immigration bail, they can contact the Home Office to consider removing the study restriction. So let's take stock of this with 2 MPs, Chris Philp for the Conservatives, Nash Shah, Labour MP, and a member of the Home Office Affairs Select Committee, which quizzed Amber Rudd this afternoon. Very good evening to you. Let's just start with that case. Chris Philp, what's your view of clearly a rigorous enforcement of the rules and a new rule that says you can't study here if you're an asylum seeker on appeal? You can't take your exams. Does that seem fair to you?
Well, I think you need to look at the individual circumstances to be able to make that judgment. I think if someone is in the country illegally, and I'm not saying that was the case in the case study we just saw, you know, I think it's reasonable to say that access to things like education, which is very expensive, should be restricted. Now, because if someone comes here illegally, then why should taxpayers pay for them to receive services? Now, the case we just saw was on appeal, and I can see that after High Court review, they decided that while somebody lodges an appeal, they should have access to education. And I must say, at first glance, and I've only just seen the case, that does seem to be reasonable, that while someone appeals, they should be able to access education. Yeah. But of course, that wasn't a Windrush case we just saw.
No, not. But this is the point: is that we've had a glimpse of what hostile environment means. We're seeing that there are just going to be lots and lots of different examples of the way in which it's being applied. And I'm interested in whether you're kind of uncomfortable to see that we've said to someone who's been in school, oh, look, you've got, 2 months your A-levels, stop, you can't study anymore.
Well, it sounds like the High Court decided that the rules had not been correctly applied, and my instinct is to agree with the High Court.
You wouldn't really want an average asylum seeker to have to go lawyer up and get judicial review at the High Court to kind of enforce that, would you?
Well, if their application was still live and hadn't been finally decided, no, you wouldn't. But if someone's here illegally or has had their application definitively rejected, then I think it is reasonable to say they can't access services. Okay. And if we're talking about the wider issue of illegal immigration, of course...
Then you would say you don't get the right.
And of course the Windrush cases are not illegal. They have every right to be here. But if someone's here illegally, I think it's quite proper that they don't access benefits, they can't access services, and they ultimately face deportation. That's only fair, because without that, the immigration rules mean nothing.
Now, Shah, I'm interested in your view as to how far you think we should extend, if you like, concessions, extend a less hostile, a non-hostile environment. Everybody? Or do you think there's some, this case here, what would be your view of that?
Well, in this case here, this isn't the only case. That my constituency deals with many cases every week. We have about 15. And I can tell you that the amount of mistakes that we get, this asylum seeker to have to go to judicial review for what should have been really, really simple case-by-case basis clearly hasn't worked. And what this demonstrates is, in addition to Windrush, that it's not just an issue of Windrush, there's an actual systemic failure within the Home Office in dealing with cases.
Right, but do you agree that we do have to... Do you agree we have to enforce some kind of border, and that means you have to be tough on some people who simply aren't allowed to be here, even though their cases, by the way, may be deeply sympathetic in personal
I
terms?
absolutely agree that the law must be applied, but there is the essence of the law and there's the letter of the law, isn't there? And ultimately, these are people we're talking about. These are individual people, and we should be looking at them as an individual. And in this case, the court has upheld the right, and rightfully so.
I mean, out of all of this, of the last week and a half, Chris Philp, do you think hostile environment as a policy can possibly survive?
Well, if by hostile environment you mean saying that for people who are here illegally, we try and take them back to where they should be and we don't give them access to benefits and things, I think that is actually a reasonable approach.
The issue is though, how you treat the people while you work out whether they're here illegally. Because we don't know if a random person is here illegally or not. And we've been treating everybody as hostile until we're sure they're allowed here. Now, can that survive or not?
Well, I think we need to be much more careful about the way those determinations are made and about the speed. And what the Windrush cases, which are tragic and wrong, do show is that we need to be faster and, in those sort of cases, use a bit more discretion. Now, I had, in all the immigration cases I get as a Croydon MP, and I've probably had about 1,000 in the last 3 years, I had one Windrush case before this publicity and I've had one subsequently. And it was clear to me, looking at that a more sympathetic and much quicker approach should have been taken, and that is one lesson I think we can and should learn.
I wonder what both of you think, just in a sentence. Amber Rudd seemed to not want to use the word hostile environment. She called it compliance environment, I think, Naz.
Actually, what Amber Rudd said was she still doesn't know all the facts. She still doesn't know whether we've got targets, regional targets, that have contributed to this hostile environment. Her minister didn't know whether they had... These are things that are... there's a lot more to come down the track, as Yvette said today. This isn't the last we've heard of Windrush, or indeed the culture in the Home Office, which has led to this outright what people have...
But Natasha, do you accept you've got to have a certain toughness there? You know, if bailiffs were all nice, understanding, sympathetic people, they would never collect any money from anyone they ever visited. What is your policy about how you enforce the border?
Well, the thing is, we're not talking about enforcing the border on this, and we're talking about people who were legally invited here, who were British nationals, and actually what the Home Office has done has treated them with indignity.
We're trying to work out whether they're British or not, aren't we?
That's disgraceful. Right. These are people...
But you've got to work out whether people are British or not at some point, don't you?
But these are people who were born British. These are British nationals who were told, and subsequently they have been treated. There are people who have had to go to food banks. We heard from a lady today who had to sell her car, who sold belongings, her own belongings, to be able to survive while she was being determined whether she was British or not.
So in the Windrush case...
This was a British woman.
Look, in those Windrush cases Naz is describing, I completely agree. Those decisions should have been taken virtually instantaneously, and it's wrong that they weren't. But in cases where someone is here illegally, and that is clear, they shouldn't be able to access benefits or work.
The really big issue, and interesting issue, is how this wasn't noticed earlier. So, I mean, let's just go through this. So 10 days ago, the government didn't want to meet Caribbean leaders on this. The Foreign Office has known since 2016. The Foreign Office told the Home Office, so they must have known. There must have been Home Office cases. MPs knew and were reporting cases. The Guardian have been reporting it for 6 months. If your press office has missed it, the Guardian writer is married to Joe Johnson, who is in the government, for goodness sake, has been writing about it. It's not the case that the government didn't know about it, is it? It's the case the government knew about it and they thought it didn't matter until the press went haywire over it.
No, well, look, it's categorically not the case that the government thinks this doesn't matter. The government thinks it matters hugely, and that's why they've responded so quickly after that debate Monday of last week, with compensation offers, with a new task force, with cases getting settled within a matter of a couple of weeks.
Because the press made a big fuss. They couldn't care when they just knew about it in private, could they?
So what Amber Rudd said clearly in the Home Affairs Committee today is that she had seen individual cases that were flagged by the press and by the High Commissioner from Jamaica over a period of a few months. But it was only a week and a half ago she realised there was a systemic issue. And I do sort of understand that, because I've dealt with about probably 1,000 immigration cases in my constituency in the last 3 years, and I've had 2 Windrush cases, one of which was in the last week. Now, if you have that sort of, 1 out of 1,000, you can see why you might conclude there's no systemic issue. That was clearly wrong. Got it. And they've apologised, and we're going to fix it.
But actually, the fact is that the Home Office does not have the system to be able to make them patterns and analogies or an individual case.
Does she have to resign? Does Amber Rudd have to resign?
What Amber Rudd has to do is fix her house. And
you're not calling her for to resign?
At the moment, Diane Abbott has certainly called for her resignation, but this is something that has been historic. This is something that was flagged up. Today, we saw the EQI assessment, which was signed off by the ministers in her department, where all of this was written out in 2015 in a policy document. So these are ministers who are signing off documents without reading them, which impact on communities and people.
OK, no, well, it's interesting that you're not personally saying she has to go now. Look, thank you both. Now, Shari, I want to ask you about one other thing, anti-Semitism. Len McCluskey in the New Statesman has written a pretty interesting article today saying a lot of Labour MPs are using this to attack Jeremy Corbyn. He names names: John Woodcock, Chris Philp, Neil
Hang on,
Coyle.
I'm not a Labour MP.
No, sorry, not Chris Leslie. Chris Leslie, I beg your pardon. Chris Leslie, do you agree with Len McCluskey, and do you think it's helpful for him to write
You'll
that
have to forgive me that I haven't read the actual article because I've been busy with Windrush today. Len's entitled to his opinion, but let's be clear about what Jeremy Corbyn has said. He's met with the Board of Jewish Deputies, he's met with the JLC, and they have agreed steps forward, and I think that's a really, the right way to be going.
Do you think people like John Woodcock are smearing Jeremy Corbyn, or do you think it is? And do you think it's helpful for Len McCluskey to make that charge while relations between Labour and the Jewish community are being repaired?
Anybody who's suggesting anything about smears of anything are not doing it in Jeremy Corbyn's name, so let's be clear about that. What Jeremy Corbyn is saying, and what he's done and he's been really clear about, is here is a roadmap which we need to go down, and it's the right one to work with the Jewish community and the Board of Deputies and the JLC.
Nice shot. Thanks for that,
Thank you.
Not Chris Leslie. Thank you both very much.